spiritual disciplines. And so far we've spoken of 4. We began back in the middle of July, and we started off with prayer, and then we went to Bible study, then we went to meditation, and then last week we talked about fasting. Wow, all of you remember. Did any of you do it? I'm not going to. I told you, that may be one of the more difficult ones to perform, not because it has such difficulty built into it, but we tend to make it difficult. But this morning we're going to look at one that's a little bit different. You may not have ever grasped the concept that this could be a spiritual discipline, but we're going to talk about it anyway. Matthew chapter 6, a very familiar text. I mentioned now that at the beginning of chapter 6, Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount starts off talking about giving, and then he moves to praying, and then he moves to fasting. Now we've talked about praying and fasting. We have not talked about giving, and as such, this is not going to be a sermon on giving this morning, but it is going to be a sermon that deals with the whole concept, if you will, of materialism. He began this chapter, and of course when he was speaking these things, he wasn't speaking by chapters, of course, but he begins with the whole concept of the financial, the giving part, and then the rest of the chapter, beginning with verse 19 through the end of the chapter, through verse 33, or 34, that's what he talks about, is materialism, if you will. So let's read verses 19 through 24 this morning of Matthew chapter 6. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moth and rust do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The eye is the lamp of the body, and if your eyes are good, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? No one can serve 2 masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Now I want to say at the outset, this is not going to be an exegetical sermon, taking these 6-7 verses here and breaking them down and talking about each one of them. I'm not going to do that. It's going to be more of a topical thing because I want us to think in terms of the whole idea that you've heard many, many times. Enough is enough. Enough is enough. Now, sometimes we use that phrase to describe the difficulty that we have in putting up with something. Many of us right now, for the last few months, have been saying, enough is enough. I've had it with this. We've put up with about all we can with all the stuff that's happening relative to the COVID virus, and then all the unrest, the civil unrest, and all the other stuff that's going on, not only in our nation, but around the world. Enough is enough. But sometimes this has the idea of acquisition. At some point you have to say, I can't get any more in the house. The house is full, and so enough is enough. Let's cut it off someplace. I've used this quote before. I think it's one of my favorites. It comes from the character Sabrina Fairchild in the movie Sabrina, where she says to Linus Larrabee, more isn't always better, Linus. Sometimes it's just more. And either some of you know the movie really well, or you've heard me quote it often enough. Okay, all right. Richard Foster, in his book, The Freedom of Simplicity, says this: contemporary culture is plagued by the passion to possess. The unreason to boast abounds that the good life is to be found in accumulation and that more is better. Indeed, we often accept this notion without question, with the result that the lust for affluence has become psychotic. It has completely lost touch with reality. And in many cases, that's true of a lot of folk. Now, I came across this quote. I want to read it to you. I didn't tell you where it came from. I thought it was kind of interesting, what it says and the era from which it comes. This person said, our enormously productive economy demands that we make consumption our way of life, that we convert the buying and the use of goods into rituals, that we seek our spiritual satisfaction, our ego satisfaction in consumption. And that's not the sickness, by the way, that's consuming stuff, okay? We need things to be consumed, burned up, worn out, replaced, and discarded at an ever-increasing rate. Sometimes we buy something with the anticipation that it will break and we can get the next new one when it comes out. Now, there's a couple of views on this. The first one has to do with what we might call multiplicity. I know it's a big fat word, and it's akin to its cousin, duplicity. Now, duplicity sometimes means evil, but all it means is to duplicate or to multiply, okay? Multiplicity and duplicity. It means more and more and more, and usually of the same things in excessive abundance. And as you go into your homes today, look around and see, or before you get to your home, maybe when you get in your car, look around and see, do I have things in ever-increasing abundance, some of the same stuff, excessive abundance. Now, multiplicity and duplicity stand over against what the spiritual discipline is today, and it's called simplicity. Simplicity. Simplicity means minimalism. I can get by with a minimal amount. I don't have to have everything there is to have. And simplicity is an inward reality. It's an inward kind of ideology that results in an outward lifestyle. Someone has said that simplicity brings freedom, duplicity is bondage. And if you know anything about having a lot of stuff, you know it's bondage. You're always having to keep it clean or work with it or fix it or whatever. Simplicity is freedom. Duplicity is bondage. Simplicity brings joy and balance. Duplicity brings anxiety and fear. The Jewish Bible translation of Ecclesiastes 7:29 says this: God made man simple. Man's complex problems are of his own devising. God made us as simple as we could be. I mean, when you look at the human body, it's a fascinating thing, but it's as simple as it can be. Our problems come from our own devising. But when simplicity reigns, we give up the desire for more possessions, more status, more position, whatever it happens to be. So I want to ask a question or two this morning that will help us a little bit in kind of getting a grasp on it. First of all, how do we know whether we are consumed with multiplicity or duplicity? How do we know we're eaten up with this, the idea that we have to possess more and more and more? Well, there's 3 or 4 questions that we might ask ourselves that will help us a little bit. The first question is, whom do we admire or envy? Whom do we admire or envy? Oftentimes, we admire people that have stuff. And the more stuff they have, the more we admire them. Oftentimes, we envy people's stuff. And the more stuff they have, the more we envy them. Those with more. Or maybe those whose lives, or is it those whose lives are defined by the possession or acquisition of things? Is it people that are kind of climbing the ladder of success and man, look at them go, look at all the stuff they're able to do? Or do we admire and kind of envy those who have found the key to the simple life? I have a good friend in North Carolina, he'll be 86 in December. And I don't know anyone that has learned simplicity and practiced it better than this guy. Just as simple a person as it can come, and yet really deep spiritually. And it's just, if I were to envy someone, I think it might be this friend of mine. Jesus said in Matthew 8:18 through 20, when it says, when Jesus saw the crowd around him, he gave orders to cross to the other side of the lake. And then a teacher of the law came to him and said, Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go. How many of us have said that? I'm going to follow you, Jesus, wherever you go. Jesus replied, Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. Many people, even people who aren't church people, admire Jesus, except for one particular area in his life. Not too many people admire Jesus' financial prowess. They don't say, boy, Jesus, he was a great teacher, and just look at all he was able to acquire and able to accomplish and able to stash back. I mean, here he was, the Son of God. Look at all the stuff. No one says that. Second question, in addition to whom do we admire or envy, second question that we might ask ourselves is, how easily can we part with things? How easily can we part with things? If you're like me, tossing stuff is nearly impossible sometimes, isn't it? Tossing stuff. Oh, so-and-so gave me that. I just can't throw that away. Oh, I've had that thing. One of the things I do in marriage counseling when young couples, and we got a few in here that I've already talked with about this, and they come in, I have 2 clipboards. And one I give to the gals and one I give to the guys. And the one I give to the guys is special. Why, guys? I've had it for a very long time. I've had it since I was 9 years old, given to my best friend in school at the time. I mean, this thing is 57 years old, 57 years that I've had it, okay? And I can't get rid of it. And so I still use it because it has benefit, but I haven't replaced it, let's say. It's tough sometimes. The inability to part with the old, coupled with the need to purchase the new, is one of those things that is, combined makes it difficult for us to practice simplicity in life. Admiral Richard Byrd, in his journal from his Arctic expedition entitled Alone, said this: "I am learning that man can live profoundly, not just exist, not just get along, but can live profoundly without masses of things." Some years ago, I came across this little key that I'm going to pass along to you. It's not mine, but I think it's a kind of a neat little key to kind of keep yourself as simple as possible. And that is, make out a list of things that you want, about anywhere between 5 and 10 things. Not things that you need, okay? Now, when you need something, you need it, but make out a list of things that you want. And then you prioritize them in terms of, I want this more than I want this, and I want this more than I want this. And you go down the list and you get them in line. But you don't go buy any of them. As the month goes on, write something else that you want, that you've discovered, that goes on the list. And then at the end of the month, you prioritize them again, but you don't buy any of them. You'll find that a lot of the things that you had on the list to start with go off the list, and some of the things you added move up. Okay? And so you have a new list, but you don't go buy any of them. You do that the next month, and the next month, and the next month. You keep repeating, and you find out all the things you thought you had to have, you didn't really need at all. It's kind of a good way of kind of moving away from multiplicity or duplicity, if you will. And the third question you might ask is, does our culture uncontrollably influence us? Culture knows very little about simplicity. It doesn't know anything about it. You ever seen a commercial encouraging people not to buy stuff? You don't see anybody coming on and saying, we know you're in debt enough already, so don't come out and buy this thing. Nobody's going to say that. That'd be crazy, wouldn't it? That doesn't get them anywhere. Our culture has made us feel ashamed of the clothes we wear, of the cars we drive, or the homes we live in. And so we have to, we've got to improve on all those things because this one's much better than the one you have. And so we take a ride on this accumulation highway. Now, which of the 2 following individuals is more highly regarded in our society? One who is poor and purposefully works to become rich, or one who is rich and voluntarily becomes poor? Well, we call the first person hardworking and enterprising, don't we? We call the second one crazy. Or we might call that person Jesus. Remember what Paul wrote to the Corinthians, 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 9? "For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was" what? "Rich. That though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, so that you through his poverty might become rich." Second question, big question, if you will, this morning is, what is the Bible's view of simplicity? Well, the Jews had a picture of it. Unfortunately, they never really practiced it that we can figure out. It was referred to as the year of Jubilee, and you can read about it in Leviticus 25. I'm not going to take the time to do that. But every 50 years in that nation, all the property was to revert to its original ownership. Now think about that. As some of us have acquired things, think about somebody coming in and saying, "You've had that for this is 50 years now, and some of these things you've had for 50 years, some you've had for 25, some you've had for 6 months, but everything that you have that you acquired that belonged to someone else, especially property, is going to revert back to them." How many of us would like that? Yeah. The interesting thing is, and I've done a lot of looking around on this. There's really not a lot of evidence to suggest that the Jews ever actually observed the year of Jubilee. Sounds kind of common, doesn't it? They learn like everybody else to say that word that we learned when we're very young. M-I-N-E. The other one was right on top of it. Mine, 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 mine. All the citizens who sold themselves into slavery, all the Jewish citizens who sold themselves into slavery to their own people had to be freed because they belonged to the Lord just like the property belonged to the Lord. And no family, this ensured a regular distribution of wealth. It ensured that no family was held captive forever. What an interesting idea. And so all these purchases that people were making over those 50 years were really only leases. I'm leasing it to you for a while, and it's going to come back to my family at some point in time. Now let's look at Jesus' picture of simplicity. Jesus knew the grip of materialism. That's why he said the words he said that we read in this text this morning. He said this. I've contemporized it a whole lot, okay? Remember, he said, "Where your heart is, there will be your treasure." Here's a contemporary version. Where our investments are is where our focus will be. Where our investments are where our focus will be. Now, I don't know if any of you here own stock. But if you own stock, you check the stock market. But you probably don't check the stocks that you don't have. You can probably care less about those stocks. I hope they all tank, so mine that I have will go up, perhaps. Maybe not saying that. The more we have, the more we will be distracted from spiritual matters is what Jesus was trying to tell us. So, this was lived out in a real sense back when I was a young person. I was a teenager, and we were in church one Sunday night, my home church back in North Carolina. It was a hot summer night, and all the windows were open in the church. And the preacher of my home church, his name was Jim Vernon, a great preacher. He preached my ordination, and Jim was one of these, we'll just call him a hellfire and brimstone kind of guy. I mean, he was really letting it fly that night. And it came up a thunderstorm. And we said that he preached up a storm, and so I guess it happened. But it came up a thunderstorm, and when the cloud burst happened right over the church and rain started pouring, people started dashing for the door because they were running out to their automobiles because they'd left windows down. And I'll never forget, as they ran Jim was talking about materialism somehow, and as they ran to their cars, he said, "And that includes those cars you're going out to save." So it was we had a real nice visual there all of a sudden of what he was talking about. Someone said, "Simplicity is the only thing that sufficiently reorients our lives so that possessions can be genuinely enjoyed without destroying us. It sets us free to receive the provision of God as a gift that is not ours to keep and can be freely shared with others. Of all the disciplines, simplicity is the most visible and therefore the most open to criticism." People can tell whether or not we're living simplistic lives, can't they? Jesus said in Matthew 6:33, if you're going down farther in the text from where we read this morning, "But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and what? All these things will be given to you as well." And doing this keeps everything else in its proper order and proper place and proper perspective. Someone has said the person who does not seek the kingdom first does not seek it at all. There's a lot of truth to that. Now, when I'm talking about simplicity, I'm not talking about abundance or lack of abundance. We're not talking about people who are rich and poor here when we talk about simplicity. Simplicity is an inward spirit that trusts God regardless of our situation and circumstances, whether we're in abundance or whether we're in poverty. You remember this guy that came to Jesus in Mark chapter 12, we refer to him as the rich young ruler. We don't know if he was young or he ruled anything, but we do know that he was rich. And he came to Jesus wanting to know what the key to salvation was. And Jesus said, "Well, you got all these commandments to follow." He said, "I've done all that stuff since I was a kid." Jesus said, "Well, there's just one thing you got to straighten up, and that is you got to move back to simplicity." You've got to sell what you have and give it to the poor and think about them. And, well, that wasn't going to happen, was it? He was one who was focusing on anything but simplicity. Jesus says, simplify your life. Make this easy on yourself. You're trusting in the wrong things and they have control of you. Third big question this morning is, how simple can this be? Well, you would think, and I was having a conversation with Ann and Joe this morning before service started, and we were talking about the things that seem simple often aren't. Have you noticed that? We can finish this job in 30 minutes, and 2 days later, you're still trying to figure out how to do the job. How simple can it be? Well, let me ask this question. In a high-tech culture, can we be simpler? Can life rather be simpler in the midst of the modernization we face? We're just consumed with it, I know, and we don't mean to be. It just happens to us sometimes. Dallas Willard says, in Spirit of the Disciplines, he says this: the person who has grown to the place where he can truly seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness is a person who has entered simplicity. That person puts all the demands that come to them in their place and deals harmoniously, peacefully, confidently with complexities of life that seem incomprehensible to others, for they know what they're doing. That's why I think about my friend in North Carolina I was talking about. Somehow this dude, he's got it. He just got it. He's got it figured out. Man, it's such a beautiful thing. Look at... Probably a year ago now, we were preaching our way through the book of Philippians. And you may remember this particular text from Philippians 4, beginning with verse 10, where the Apostle Paul said this: I rejoice greatly in the Lord that at last you have renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you have been concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. And I'm not saying this because I'm in need, for I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstances. Remember that? He said, I can be content in any circumstance. For I know what it is like to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I've been poor and I've been rich. Now he might come up and say rich is better, but he says, I know them both. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in every situation. That secret is called simplicity. Now, he doesn't state it like that there, but here's how he attributes the key. I've learned the secret. I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. And so what Paul is saying there is, you remember we talked about that, how people yank that 13th verse out of context and try to make it mean everything. Paul's saying, look, the way you overcome all this, the way you're able to deal with it, the way you move back to simplicity, the way I have, he says, is I figured out that I can do everything. I can exist in any situation because I have Jesus Christ living in my life, and I can do everything through him. Now I want to share with you very quickly 3 simplicity attitudes that you have to have if you're going to make this work. The first one is very simple, and that is to understand that what we have, all we possess, what we have comes from God as a gift. Now, a lot of us think that we go out and earn our living. And we work hard, many of us. But let me tell you, what we have is a gift of God. And sometimes God rewards people who work really hard, and sometimes it comes later. But what we have comes from God as a gift to us, okay? The second attitude that we need is, as stewards then, the things he's given us, we are stewards over those things. As stewards, we manage what he gives us, but he is the one who protects it and guides it for his service. He's taking care of it, but we're managing it for the time being. And the third attitude is this: what we have stewardship over must be made available for use in God's service, especially for others. See, all the things he's given us stewardship over, they really are not ours either in this life or in the next. We're sending things on ahead in the next that he'll take care of. But what he gives us stewardship over right now is to be used for the blessing of other people. Someone has said this: if our goods, that is all our possessions, if our possessions are not available to the community when it is clearly right, then they are stolen goods. Now, I want to kind of sum all this up here with the following. Here's some outward expressions of simplicity. How do we know that we're living the life of simplicity? Well, as it concerns material things, okay, that's what we're talking about. Purchase things for their usefulness and not as a status symbol. Purchase things for their usefulness and not as a status symbol. Oh, me. Many of you have heard me talk about my friend Odell, from whom I have bought most of my cars for the last 30 plus years. He has such a great saying because he gives, he sells cars and gives people such great deals on vehicles. And so he has this saying, and I love it. So I think about it all the time. He says, I would hate to wake up in the morning and know that what is sitting in the driveway is the reason I have to get up and go to work. Yeah, that's a $500 car payment on that thing. I got to get up and go to work. He says, I'd hate to wake up in the morning and know that the reason I'm going to work is because I'm taking care of that out there and not taking care of me or someone else. And so while I'm at it, let me suggest this to you as a principle. This is especially good for our young people as they're starting off in life, and it's this. Do not purchase anything on credit that depreciates. Don't purchase anything on credit that depreciates, because you're going to lose money big time, both directions, both on the interest you're paying and on the depreciation. Second thing, in addition to purchasing things for their usefulness, is reject anything which can produce an addiction. I read the story of a man who had to read the newspaper every morning. That was his thing. He had to have his morning newspaper, and he took the newspaper, and one morning he went out, and his newspaper wasn't in his driveway or his sidewalk or whatever, and he looked around and he couldn't find it. No newspaper. Everyone, he said, all the other people around the neighborhood had newspapers, and so he said, I began thinking and scheming how I could sneak across and get my neighbor's newspaper because I had to read the newspaper. And suddenly it dawned on him, I have an addiction. He said, I turned around, went inside, and called the newspaper and canceled my subscription. You see, an addiction is by its nature anything which is beyond our ability to control or relinquish. And some people just, whatever it happens to be, it can become an addiction. Third thing, cultivate the habit of giving things we do not need to people who do need them. What a great idea that is. It's not my idea, by the way, but cultivate the habit of giving things away. There are people that probably could use some of the stuff that we have just sitting around. I had a couple of tires one time that I wasn't using, and I said to my car guy that I just mentioned, I said, I've got a couple of tires that they're practically brand new, and I won't be using them again. And I said, you know what we might like to have them? He said, yeah, I'll be glad to take them and give them to so-and-so. And I thought, well, they're my tires. I was thinking about selling them. He was thinking about giving them. I guess it was easier since they weren't his tires to give them. But think about it. Listen to what Ephesians 4:28 says. He who has been stealing must steal no longer, but must work doing something useful with his own hands so that he may have something to share with those who are in need. Part of the reason that we put in a lot of hours and time and make extra money shouldn't only be for ourselves, but finding out a way to bless someone else's life. Fourth thing, refuse to be seduced by modern day gadgetry. Goodness gracious alive. I mentioned it earlier that sometimes we buy something today knowing that there'll be a new one in 3 weeks that we'll have to buy it too. We all know that our computer when we buy it today or our phone when we buy it today in 6 months from now will be obsolete, don't we? We all know that. And so it's easy to get sucked into having the very best right now and then turning around and 6 months later having the very best again. So refuse to be, because you can literally spend a fortune on this stuff today. And the final one on this is learn to enjoy things without owning them. Don't be consumed with ownership. God's given us a lot of things that we can enjoy without owning them. You know that? And you can't, in this area, we have some amazing sunrises and sunsets, and they're free. They're free. God doesn't charge us anything. He just throws them out there every morning and every night, and we can't buy it and keep it from everyone else. Everybody gets it for nothing, basically, just for the love of Christ. The 1980s was known as the decade of greed. I'm not sure we're out of it yet, but I remember very distinctly in 1987, I think I may have shared this story with you, but I remember in 1987 going to New York to visit my cousin and to meet up with a friend. And as I was returning from that trip, there were two young couples sitting behind me, probably a little bit younger than me. And both of them were talking about in 1987, early on, those of us who were around back then, you may remember, was a very, very good year financially in the early part of the year. The stock market was going crazy, kind of like it is now. People were just making hand over fist. And these two couples were they were just wallowing in how much money they had made in the stock market. And this was in August of 1987. In October, many of us remember, the stock market did what? It just went almost like a 1929 deal. It just went crashing down. And I thought about those two young couples. I wondered if all of it got wiped out in just a short time. Someone has said riches and abundance come hypnotically clad in sheep's clothing, pretending to be security against anxieties, and they become the object of anxiety. We think if we've got a lot of stuff that it's going to help us break free from our anxiety, when actually with a lot of stuff you've more to be anxious about. He said they secure a man against anxieties just about as well as the wolf, which is put to tending the sheep, secures them against the wolf. And when I read that, first thing I thought about was a Looney Tunes character by the name of Ralph the Wolf. He looks a whole lot like Wile E. Coyote, those of us who've seen him. When Ralph wants to steal sheep from Sam the sheepdog, what does he do? He dresses up like a sheep. And that's what happens with all this stuff. It comes to us in a way that thinks it's bringing us blessing, and it's actually robbing us of things that are more important. Harold Kushner, in his book, When All You've Ever Wanted Isn't Enough, tells the story. He said, I was sitting on a beach one summer day watching two children, a boy and a girl, playing in the sand. They were hard at work building an elaborate sand castle by the water's edge with gates and towers and moats and internal passages. And just when they had nearly finished their project, a big wave came along and knocked it down, reducing it to a heap of wet sand. I expected the children to burst into tears, devastated by what had happened to all their hard work. But they surprised me. Instead, they ran up the shore away from the water, laughing and holding hands, and sat down to build another castle. And I realized that they had taught me an important lesson. All the things in our lives, all the complicated structures we spend so much time and energy creating are only built on sand. Only our relationship with people, and I might add with God, endures. Sooner or later, the wave will come along and knock down whatever we work so hard to build up. And when that happens, only the person who has somebody's hand to hold will be able to laugh. As we look and think about our lives, only the person who's able to hold on to the hand of God is going to be able to face all these difficult times when we think, well, I can trust in this and trust in that, and it won't let me down, because it always does. And that's why simplicity is such a wonderfully keen, if you will, spiritual discipline for us to learn to cultivate. And I think, just to pat you all on the back just a little bit, I think one of the reasons that I appreciate and enjoy living here where we live is because a lot of people have discovered that lesson already. That it's not about acquisition, it's not about trying to have the biggest or the best or the newest or the fastest or whatever, but it's all about making certain that our lives are built on the foundation of the Lord Jesus Christ. We have the opportunity now to speak with a young lady. I'm going to ask Abby if she'll come up this morning. I've had the opportunity to talk with Abby about her relationship with Jesus. And she comes this morning desiring to express her faith in Him and accept Him as Lord and Savior. We're going to go over and baptize her in a few moments. And so I know we're all going to be excited with her and we look forward to it. I'm going to ask you this morning to repeat the good confession after me. I believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, my Lord and my Savior. God bless you. Make that confession. We're going to pray now and finish our prayer, and then we'll send you with the mom when we get ready for baptism, and then as we close our service,
angels of heaven are rejoicing over this Lord who has surrendered her life to you. We know of her faith. Even though she's young, she knows exactly who it is she's supposed to be following her not only this day, but all the days of her life. And we just pray and ask to bless her and strengthen her as since Christ has baptized in him, she wants to live the life. Forgiveness of sins and bless her family.